But that's how attached I was to Nguyen Van Tai, how admiring of him I was. And I think about him not because I idealized his ideology, which I didn't. He was a terrorist, he was a terrible man. But because as a human being, in the most horrible circumstances, he had held himself together. How could you not admire that? He had been responsible for American deaths. He was a killer himself. But he was a study in brilliant commitment to his cause. And that, my friends, is one of the reasons we didn't win in Vietnam, because there were too many Nguyen Van Tais on the other side. They went right, but brother, were they committed. And in their mistaken belief that the Americans were somehow heirs to French colonialism, these people would do anything to win. They would sacrifice one generation after another to beat the Americans and to take over the South. And by the way, the North Vietnamese weren't entitled to the South. Vietnam had always been a crazy quilt of competing factions. And one faction was the North, other faction the South. No one had the right to command what another faction was doing. It's like Eastern Europe. I mean, there were all sorts of states within a state or semi-states. The northern part of Vietnam was very different from the central part, which was very different from Saigon. So anyone who tells you that the North had the mantle of heaven, that the communists were predestined to own the South, they're blowing smoke. They're simply recapitulating Frantz Fanon and some of the French revolutionary philosophers who influenced so many of the anti-war movement people in the United States. This is nonsense. Nonsense. Let me tell you something. Every time a mass of South Vietnamese had to vote with their feet, in other words, when there was a refugee flow from one embattled area to another, did the refugees flow to the communists or to the South? My friends, they flowed always to the southern lines. Now you may say it's because they were afraid of being bombed by American aircraft. No. They flowed that way because they felt, these refugees, and this was true from the moment I arrived in Vietnam to the end. There were ralliers from the other side. There were refugees. They flowed towards the government because the money was there and the security was there, and the enemy didn't have anything to sell them of an enduring nature. Because most Southerners didn't know about ideology. They didn't buy into, because they were working with Americans elbow to elbow. They knew Americans weren't there to restore French glory, the French Empire, to establish an American empire. They weren't there to steal the resources of the South. They were there stupidly, Americans were, because they believed stupidly that communism was monolithic, that the North Vietnamese were just the same as the Chinese, were just the same as the Soviets, and that all these people were conspiring to take over the free world. That was baloney. That was baloney. There was a group of people in the North, hardliners, Le Duan and his ilk, who were basically imperialist aggressors. They believe for no reason, like Putin, say, in Ukraine, that they own the South. And they went after it. And people like Nguyen Van Tai, my prisoner, this high-ranking cadre, they bought into this mindset. But never let anyone tell you, none of these revisionists of the war, never let them tell you that the communists owned the mandate of heaven. They didn't. Some of them were just damn good imperialists. And they were able to rally the North in a crusade against the South. And by the way, Ho Chi Minh was not one of them. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, the hero of Dien Bien Phu, defeated the French there. They were, in the mid-1960s, pushed aside right before Ho died. He was on the outs with the hardliners running in Hanoi because he wasn't tough enough. Ho had debated the wisdom of sending an expeditionary force from the north into the south in 1964 and 5. He didn't want to do it. But the hardliners won, and they were the imperialists in Vietnam. And God bless it, they were going to take over the South. And that's the way it was. And you may say, well, Frank, what do you know? I was there, friends, and I interrogated the highest ranking Viet Cong North Vietnamese cadre we ever captured. And let me tell you something. He would have laughed at the anti-war movement. He would have viewed them as dupes and suckers, because the North Vietnamese suckered a lot of Americans into believing that the right was on the side of the North. And Nguyen Van Tai would have laughed at that. Footnote to Nguyen Van Tai. There was a famous novel about Vietnam written by Viet Thanh Nguyen. It's called The Sympathizer, won the Nobel Prize, okay? And it's the talk of the Vietnamese expatriate community and diaspora, because he's a wonderful writer, he's a friend of mine, I greatly admire his style. The Sympathizer, the hero, the protagonist of The Sympathizer, is modeled after Nguyen Van Tai, my prisoner. How do I know this? Well, it occurred to me when I read The Sympathizer that it couldn't be accidental that the protagonist of that novel was being held in a Snow White interrogation room. And when I flip to the end of the book, I see that Viet Thanh Nguyen actually credits my own memoir as one of his primary sources. And I've talked to the author personally, and he admits that certain of his characters, including Claude, the CIA agent, bear certain resemblance to me. And I have told Viet Thanh Nguyen, this wonderful young author who trained at Berkeley and whose parents fled Vietnam, I've told him, I said, you know, the real Nguyen Van Tai would have despised you. He would have viewed you as a dupe, because Nguyen Van Tai was not ambivalent. He wasn't a sympathizer. He was the real deal. And he would have laughed at the final scenes in that book, which have the protagonist unable to figure out which side he's on. Nguyen Van Tai knew which side he's on, and that's why people like him won this war for their side. Just a personal observation. When I was in my heyday as an interrogator, I always went into an interrogation with the idea of establishing rapport with the interrogee, not allowing him to be tortured, but to try to reach him through his mind and his emotions. And that meant that I had to do homework for those interrogations you would not believe, baby. I had to read into the prisoner's background. I had to get to know him as if he were a family member, so that when I got into an exchange with him, I could draw upon this to reach his heart. To reach his heart. That was always my objective. And you may say, Jesus, Frank, you're really full of it. No, you know, I was in Vietnam 5.5 years, almost continuously. I interrogated a lot of people. And so, like my shtick or not, it's based on direct first-hand experience. Again, going into an interrogation, I always tried to look well-kept, or well-kempt, I should say. Well-kept is perhaps slip of the tongue because I was working for the CIA. But in any event, I always made sure to dress respectfully. And I preferred blue shirts. I'd gotten a whole bunch of them cheap in Hong Kong during an R&R trip. And I came to be known by prisoners and by interpreters working with me as the man in the blue shirt. So I believe Nguyen Van Tai, the prisoner I interrogated, this high-ranking guy, referred to me in his book, his own memoir of his experiences, as the man in the blue shirt. He didn't know my name, but that was my sobriquet, the man in the blue shirt.